The screen of the laptop cast a harsh blue light across the kitchen table. Sarah Mitchell tapped the bank application icon again, hoping the number would shift, but it remained fixed at $500. That was the entire sum. She shifted her gaze to the stack of paper beside her keyboard. Electric, rent, water. She calculated the totals in her head for the third time that hour. The numbers refused to reconcile. She pushed the laptop back, the friction of the machine against the wood sounding loud in the quiet house. Outside, the street was dark, but the fluorescent light in the kitchen hummed with a low, persistent vibration that seemed to match the tension in her chest. She picked up a past due notice, turned it over, and set it back down. The math was simple. The money was finite. The obligations were growing. She leaned back, the chair legs scraping against the floor, and looked at the empty space around her. Every corner of the room felt smaller than it had an hour ago. She closed her eyes, listening to the clock on the wall, waiting for a way forward that did not yet exist. Sarah reached for a book resting under the stack of bills. She had not opened it in months. Her fingers brushed the spine, and she pulled it toward her. She flipped through the pages until a single sentence stopped her. Successful people focus on what they have, not on what they lack. She looked at the $500 on the screen again. The number had not changed, but the way she saw it did. It was no longer a remaining balance. It was a starting point. She grabbed a notebook and a pen from the drawer. She stopped calculating the debts and started listing the inventory she could afford. She wrote down categories, scratching out items that required too much overhead, circling those that didn't. She paced the length of the small kitchen, testing the viability of each idea against the wall of her budget. The fear that had kept her frozen for hours began to dissipate, replaced by the rhythm of her pen against the paper. She was no longer waiting for the money to grow. She was deciding exactly where it would go. Her focus narrowed to the basque. The kitchen table was no longer a place of unpaid bills. It was an office. She had $500, and for the first time that felt like a surplus. The next week passed in a blur of glowing screens and late-night browsing. Sarah buried herself in niche forums, scouring threads for the one recurring complaint that everyone mentioned but no one solved. She found it tucked away in a thread about home organization, a simple, persistent frustration with storage space. She tracked down a supplier, her fingers hovering over the checkout button until the math aligned. She placed an order for 50 units, the transaction draining her account to near zero. Every dollar was now tied up in cardboard and plastic. She spent the final $50 on a domain name and a basic hosting plan. She dragged and dropped images, typed out descriptions, and hit the publish button. The website went live at 3 in the morning. She leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her eyes. She left the tab open, the dashboard showing a clean, empty state. She sat perfectly still in the quiet house, listening for the sound of a notification. A ping, a chime, anything to signal that the world had acknowledged her effort. She waited, her pulse steady, watching the cursor blink in the empty space where the first sale would appear. The first day passed without a single sound from the laptop. She checked the dashboard at dawn, then again at noon, and once more before the sun went down. The zero remained. 7 days bled into 14. The novelty of the launch had long since evaporated, replaced by a heavy, stagnant air in the apartment. Her phone began to buzz with messages from friends. They did not ask about the business. They asked if she had looked at the job listings. They told her to cut her losses before the rent was due. She read the texts, then set the phone face down on the table. She looked at the screen of her laptop. The dashboard had not moved. It was a digital tombstone for her $500. Every time she refreshed the page, the lack of activity felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She stood up to break the tension, pacing the kitchen, but the silence of the room was absolute. There was no market, no interest, and no path forward. She stared at the zero, wondering if she had built a storefront in a ghost town. The isolation was total. She was out of money, out of time, and currently out of hope. Sarah deleted the original text. She did not look for a job. Instead, she opened the website backend and tore it apart. She rewrote every description, focusing not on the product features, but on the specific, nagging frustrations of the people who needed them. She spent her nights reading free tutorials on search engine optimization, testing keywords until her eyes burned. On Saturday morning, she moved her inventory to the balcony. She used the natural light of the sun to photograph the items, framing them against the bare concrete to show their utility. She uploaded the new images, adjusted the site layout, and saved the changes. She stopped waiting for the world to notice and started forcing the world to look. She sat back, her hands trembling slightly from the sheer effort of the overhaul. She was exhausted. She was broke. She refreshed the dashboard one last time. A sharp, clear notification sound cut through the silence of the room. A ping. Then a second, distinct chime. She leaned toward the screen. The number 0 had vanished. 2 sales had appeared. The screen glowed with the proof that her work had finally breached the wall. Sarah did not take a single cent for herself. She took the profit from those first 2 sales and bought more inventory. She waited for the delivery, tagged every item, and listed them the moment they arrived. The cycle tightened. The ping of notifications became a constant rhythm. 1 sale became 3, then 10, then 50. Her bedroom floor disappeared under stacks of shipping boxes. She cleared her desk, then her bed, then the hallway, until the apartment became a staging ground for logistics. Every hour was a blur of printing labels and hauling parcels to the post office. She was no longer just a seller. She was a shipping department. The income was immediately poured back into larger orders, bulk shipping rates, and better packaging. Within weeks, the walls of her room felt like they were closing in on the inventory. She could not walk across the floor without hitting a box. She found a local garage for rent. She spent 2 days moving the entire operation, hauling crates down the stairs, loading her car, and setting up steel shelving in the new space. The garage was cold, but it was empty, and it was hers. She stood in the center of the concrete floor, surrounded by rows of stock, and watched the dashboard climb. The garage had become too small in less than a year. Boxes were stacked to the rafters, leaving only narrow paths to move. Sarah signed the lease on a proper warehouse with a loading dock and high ceilings. She walked through the empty space, her boots echoing against the polished floor. It felt immense. 2 years after that first $500 investment, a heavy-duty truck backed into the bay. The steel dock plate slammed down. The driver rolled up the door, revealing a wall of stacked pallets wrapped in plastic. Sarah grabbed her clipboard and walked to the edge of the dock. She felt the vibration of the engine through the floorboards. The driver signaled, and she stepped forward to guide the pallet jack. She navigated the heavy load through the bay doors, the wheels humming against the concrete. She checked the manifest, verified the count, and signed for the shipment with a firm, practiced hand. Each pallet represented thousands of units, a volume that would have been unimaginable in her old kitchen. She stood back, watching the forklift operator maneuver the stock into the high-reach racking. The warehouse was no longer empty. It was filled with the tangible results of her persistence. She reached for the next shipping order on her desk, ready to move the inventory out as fast as it came in. Sarah returned to her office, a partitioned corner of the warehouse floor. She pulled up the corporate dashboard on her primary monitor. The balance hit a new threshold. The number displayed 7 digits, $1 million. She sat still, the hum of the warehouse cooling system vibrating through the desk. She looked at the screen, then at her hands, still calloused from years of hauling boxes. This number was not just revenue. It was the physical manifestation of every problem she had solved since that day at the kitchen table. She remembered the unpaid bills, the empty laptop, and the silence of that first week without a single sale. She did not dwell on the wealth. She focused on the process that created it. The grit she built in the kitchen was the same grit she used today. She opened the ledger, reviewing the trajectory of the last 2 years. She stood up, walked to the warehouse floor, and looked at the rows of inventory. The scale had changed, but the work remained identical. Solve a problem, reinvest, move forward. She turned back toward her desk, her gaze fixed on the next shipping order waiting to be processed. She was already planning the next inventory cycle, the 7-figure balance already committed to future expansion. A young visitor stood near the edge of the racking, watching the inventory flow. He had been there for an hour, tracking the movement of shipments. He stepped closer as Sarah finished signing a document. He asked, "How much capital do I need to start something like this?" Sarah did not answer immediately. She walked to her desk, pulled a weathered spiral-bound notebook from the bottom drawer, and opened it to the very first page. She pointed to a single line written in ink. It was an entry from 2 years prior. $500. She looked up at him. $500 is enough to start, she said. You do not need more capital. You need more resourcefulness. The visitor leaned in, scanning the handwritten notes in the ledger. He looked at the vast rows of shelving, then back at the small, stained page. Sarah closed the book with a sharp snap. She did not elaborate. She watched him process the reality of the numbers. The warehouse was quiet, save for the distant hum of a forklift. She held his gaze until he nodded, the weight of the statement sinking in. She knew he was looking for a shortcut, but she had given him the only truth that mattered. She turned back to her desk and reached for the next shipping order. The visitor walked toward the exit, glancing back once at the rows of stacked pallets before disappearing behind the heavy steel doors. Sarah stayed at her desk. The warehouse returned to its steady, mechanical rhythm. The silence was not empty. It was the sound of a business in motion. She picked up a stack of shipping orders, her thumb flipping through the edges of the paper. There were dozens of tasks waiting. She pulled the first order to the center of her desk and reached for her pen. The ink flowed smoothly across the page. She did not reflect on the distance between the kitchen table and the warehouse floor. She focused on the task at hand. The scale of the operation had shifted, but the fundamental mechanics remained identical to those early days. Identify the need, source the solution, execute. She stamped the document, set it aside, and reached for the next one. Her movements were precise, practiced, and unhurried. A small smile touched her lips, not from the balance in her accounts, but from the familiarity of the cycle. She was building, she was solving, and she was moving forward. She turned the page of the order book and began again.